The Belgian Malinois wouldn't leave the corner of the old lighthouse keeper's cottage. Not the door, not the window, the corner. And the longer Calvin Marsh watched his dog press his nose into that rotting baseboard, the more he understood that whatever was hidden there had been waiting a very long time for exactly this moment. The wind off Puget Sound arrived like a fist that morning. It hit the bluff from the west and kept pushing, bending the shore pines sideways, lifting grit off the gravel path that wound down from the county road to the water's edge. November in Washington state didn't ease into itself. It arrived all at once and stayed. Calvin stood at the base of the property, with both hands in the pockets of a canvas work jacket he'd owned for 11 years. 64 years old, one duffel bag, one retired military working dog, $43 in his wallet, and a receipt for a property he probably shouldn't have bought. Kodiak sat beside him, scanning the bluff the way he scanned everything. Methodical, unhurried. The Malinois had served 8 years with the Army's 10th Mountain Division before a training injury retired him. Calvin had served 22. They'd been partners for the last 4 of those years, and had been inseparable in the 3 years since both of them had stopped working for anyone but each other. The auctioneer had called the place the Reardon Bluff Parcel. County records listed it as a decommissioned lighthouse property. Originally constructed in 1911, removed from active service in 1962. The main lighthouse tower had been demolished sometime in the 1970s. What remained was the keeper's cottage, a stone utility outbuilding, and 1 acre of bluffland above Admiralty Inlet. The cottage roof had partially collapsed on one side. The chimney had lost its top third to some long ago storm. Every window was boarded. The porch had given up entirely. Its boards rotted flat against the ground, like something that had finally stopped trying. The auctioneer had presented it last, almost apologetically. Minimum bid $20. Calvin had paid $23. Nobody else had raised a hand. He wasn't there because he needed a lighthouse. He wasn't there because he had a plan, or money, or any of the things that a reasonable person brings to an auction. He was there because 3 weeks earlier, his daughter had driven him to a storage unit in Tacoma, helped him load his remaining belongings into her SUV, and then explained, very carefully, that the house he'd spent 16 years rebuilding after coming home from his second deployment was being listed for sale. His name was on the deed. So was hers. So was her husband's. Estate planning, she'd called it, years ago, when they'd asked him to add them. For when something happens to you, Dad, so we can take care of things. He'd understood what that meant now. Just not soon enough. Kodiak shifted beside him and looked toward the cottage. Calvin rested a hand on the dog's neck. The Malinois' fur was coarser than it had been during active duty, and the small scar along his left ear had faded to silver. But the way he held himself hadn't changed. Alert without tension, ready without aggression. The posture of a dog that knew his job was never actually finished. The auction had moved quickly through generators and marine equipment and salvaged timber. Calvin had sat in the back row of folding chairs with Kodiak at his feet, not bidding on anything. When the lighthouse property came up, he hadn't planned to raise his hand. He'd simply felt, standing up for a better look, that he recognized something in it. Not the building, the condition of it. Something left behind after people decided it wasn't worth the trouble anymore. His hand had gone up before he'd thought it through. The receipt in his jacket pocket was still warm from the auctioneer's printer. He looked at Kodiak. The dog was already moving toward the cottage. Slowly, ears forward, nose working, the Malinois walked the path to the front door without being told. He circled once around the base of the collapsed porch, found a clear spot, and sat, waiting. Calvin followed him. He tried the door. Swollen with moisture but not locked. He pushed his shoulder into it and the wood groaned and gave. Cold air moved past them, carrying the smell of salt and rot and something else underneath her. Dust. A stillness that had been sealed in for decades. He stepped inside. The floor held, barely. Light came through gaps in the roof boards. and through the cracks around the window coverings, thin yellow bars falling across a stone floor scattered with leaves and bird droppings, and the collapsed remnants of a shelf. A rusted wood stove sat against the interior wall, an iron hook beside the door. Nothing else. Kodiak entered behind him and immediately stopped. He wasn't looking at the stove. He wasn't looking at the broken shelf. He turned his head once, slow and deliberate, and fixed his attention on the far corner of the room. Then he walked directly to it and sat down. Calvin watched him. He knew that posture. He'd seen it in forward operating bases, in checkpoint searches, in the rubble of buildings that looked abandoned until they weren't. Kodiak used his whole body to communicate. And what he was communicating right now was simple. Here. Pay attention here. Calvin crossed the room and crouched beside him. The corner was dark, the floorboards gray with age. Nothing obviously different. He ran his hand along the baseboard and found it loose. A section perhaps 2 feet wide shifted when he pressed it. Not fallen. Fitted, placed deliberately to cover something behind. He looked at Kodiak. The dog looked back at him. "All right," Calvin said quietly. "Let's find out what you're telling me." That night he slept in the stone utility building with Kodiak beside him, both of them on the same army sleeping bag he'd used on cold bivouacs 20 years earlier. The building was solid, roof intact, one window, heavy door. It felt in fact more secure than the house he'd lost. He lay awake a long time. Through the single window, stars appeared above the sound. A ferry passed in the dark, its running lights small and distant. The water reflected nothing. He thought about his daughter, Lydia, 38 years old, 2 kids, a husband named Grant who managed commercial real estate and had always been polite to Calvin in the specific way that people are polite to problems they haven't yet solved. They'd scheduled the conversation for a Sunday afternoon. Lydia had made coffee. Grant had brought paperwork. They weren't trying to hurt him. Calvin understood that. Understanding it didn't change what it had cost. Kodiak pressed closer against his leg. The dog's breathing was slow and even. Calvin rested a hand on him. Outside, the wind came off the water. The old cottage creaked under it. Whatever was in that corner had survived decades of storms and neglect. It could survive one more night. He found work 3 days later. A man named Terence Vos ran a marine salvage operation out of a dock 4 miles south along the inlet. His usual diver had quit in September and stayed quit. He hired Calvin after a 15-minute conversation, mostly because Calvin had mentioned underwater demolition training in passing, and Terence's face had changed the way people's faces change when a problem they'd stopped expecting to solve suddenly becomes solvable. It wasn't glamorous work. It was cold water and rusted hulls and equipment that needed more maintenance than it received. But it paid, and the pay was reliable. And reliable mattered more right now than comfortable. On the 3rd day, a woman driving past the Bluff property stopped her truck and walked up the path. She was in her 70s, white-haired, wearing a rain jacket with a Regional Historical Society logo on the chest. "I saw the auction notice," she said. Her name was Bev Alderton. She'd been documenting coastal lighthouse properties for 11 years. She looked at the cottage the way someone looks at an old friend who's had a very hard time of it. "I'm sorry it got to this state." Calvin shrugged. "It's still standing." "Most of it," she agreed. Then she looked at Kodiak, who had appeared at Calvin's shoulder without announcement. Bev regarded the Malinois calmly. He looked back at her with the same professional neutrality he applied to everything. "He's not usually that comfortable with strangers," Calvin said. Bev smiled. "I've got 4 grandchildren and a retired police shepherd. He knows." She came back twice that week, each time with a different folder of photographs. The lighthouse as it had stood. The keeper's house in 1938, whitewashed, flower boxes, a vegetable garden along the south wall. She knew the structure's history better than the county did, she said. The last keeper had left in 1959. His name had been James Reardon. He'd held the posting for 19 years, unusually long. His records at the Historical Society were thin. A few personnel documents, a photograph. No personal correspondence. "That's unusual too," Fee said. Most keepers wrote letters. Many kept logs beyond what the service required. Calvin thought about the corner. That Saturday, he removed the baseboard section properly. Behind it was not empty wall. There was a narrow horizontal space, perhaps 8 inches deep, running the full width of the corner. Someone had sealed it with a fitted panel of old cedar, stained to match the surrounding wood. Invisible unless you were looking for it. Kodiak sat behind him and watched. Calvin worked the panel loose with a flat bar. It came away cleanly, as if it had been made to be removed. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and then in canvas, was a box, wooden, roughly the size of a bread loaf, sealed with a simple brass latch. He carried it to the utility building and set it on the workbench under the lantern. Kodiak jumped up beside it, which he was not supposed to do, and which Calvin did not correct. The dog lowered his nose to the canvas wrapping and exhaled once, long and slow. Calvin opened the box. Inside were journals, small ones, 6 of them, covered in water-resistant black cloth. Beside them, folded paper, letters, and beneath everything, a logbook that matched the official maritime format of its era, but contained handwritten entries far beyond any routine record. The name on the inside front cover of the first journal was Eleanor Reardon. Calvin picked it up and opened it. The handwriting was precise and small, the kind developed through practice rather than schooling. The first entry was dated April 1943. He sat on the cold stone floor and read for 3 hours. Eleanor Reardon hadn't been a lighthouse keeper's wife in any passive sense. She'd been a trained signal operator who had intercepted and documented unusual maritime radio traffic throughout the war years. Her journals described coded transmissions, irregular vessel movements, anomalies in shipping patterns that she'd recorded methodically for more than a decade. The precision was extraordinary. The observations were detailed enough to constitute real naval intelligence. More than that, alongside the signal logs were her own analyses, cross-references, pattern identifications, conclusions drawn with a rigor that read less like a civilian's intuition and more like formal intelligence work. Calvin read one entry twice, then a third time. She had reported her findings, multiple times, to the local Coast Guard station, to the Lighthouse Service Regional Office, to a naval intelligence contact in Seattle, whose name appeared 3 times in the early journals, and then never again after March 1945. There was no record of any response. He set the journal down and looked at Kodiak. The Malinois was watching him steadily. Not the box, not the journals. Him. She was doing real work, Calvin said. The dog didn't answer, but his ears moved, which was enough. He slept very little that night. Twice he woke to sounds outside. Both times nothing more than the wind and the water. The third time he woke was not from sound. It was from instinct, the particular quality of wakefulness that soldiers develop when the ordinary silence of a night shifts into something slightly wrong. Kodiak was already standing. The dog was facing the cottage, motionless. Calvin sat up. He watched. He waited. Headlights swept across the bluff from the county road. A vehicle moving slowly, not pulling in, just moving. Watching gone. He lay back down. He didn't sleep again. The next morning he found tire tracks on the gravel shoulder above the bluff access path. Fresh. The tread pattern was deep and wide, a truck or large SUV. Whoever had been there had stopped long enough to leave an impression in the soft ground at the edge of the road. Calvin took a photograph with his phone. He didn't know yet why that mattered. He kept the photograph. He told Bev Alderton about the journals when she came by that Thursday. He showed her the first 3. He watched her face while she read. She read standing up, which told him something. People sit down when they think something will take a while. Bev read standing, which meant she knew almost immediately that what she was holding was not what she'd expected. "Calvin," she said finally. She looked at him. Her expression was not excited. It was careful. "I know," he said. She closed the journal. "Do you know what this would mean if her analyses are accurate?" He'd spent 4 days reading. He had a reasonable idea, but he let her say it. Bev placed the journal gently on the workbench. Eleanor Reardon documented the approach patterns of at least 3 vessels in 1943 and 1944 that appeared in no official shipping records. She wasn't just keeping personal logs. She was tracking what appeared to be unsanctioned maritime activity in these waters during wartime. And she was doing it alone. Why didn't anyone listen to her? Bev was quiet for a moment. Then, because she was the keeper's wife. Not the keeper, not an officer, not anyone whose word had institutional weight. Because the channels she reported through either ignored her or never forwarded her materials at all. And because eventually, she must have understood that if the information was going to survive, she was going to have to preserve it herself. Calvin thought about that for the rest of the day. He was cutting replacement boards for the collapsed porch section. That evening, when he heard Kodiak growl, a low sound, not urgent, not quite alarm. The kind of sound the dog made when something required acknowledgement, but not action. A man was walking up the path from the county road. Late 50s, heavy coat, hands visible, the kind of deliberate body language that people adopt when they want to appear unthreatening, which usually meant they'd thought about it. His name was Dean Thibault. He ran a private historical acquisitions firm out of Bellingham. He had a business card and a pleasant expression and a specific interest in maritime properties and their contents. "Word travels," he said. Calvin set down the saw. "What word is that?" "Old property. Sealed cottage." He glanced toward the building where Calvin slept. "Unusual finds." Calvin looked at him for a long moment. Kodiak had positioned himself at Calvin's left side, slightly forward. "Not aggressive. Present." "I appreciate the visit," Calvin said. "There's nothing here for sale." Thibault smiled in the way people smile when they believe an objection is temporary. "I understand, but if you find anything of historical interest, it would be worth a conversation. These things can have significant value to the right buyer." Calvin picked up the saw again. "I'll keep that in mind." The man left. Kodiak watched him all the way to the road. That night, Calvin moved the journals from the utility building to a location he did not discuss with anyone. He was careful about it, methodical. Controlled the sightline, left no obvious sign of the move. Old habits came back without invitation. He also called Terence Vose and asked if he knew a Dean Thibault. Terence was quiet for a beat too long. Then, "That man is not who he presents himself as. His acquisitions business is real enough, but he's had complaints. Things that pass through his hands that shouldn't have moved the way they did. You'd want to be careful there, Calvin." 3 weeks later, the historian arrived. Her name was Dr. Sandra Okwu. She taught maritime history at the University of Washington and had spent 15 years documenting the service records of women who had contributed to naval intelligence operations during World War II, most of whom appeared in no official record whatsoever. Bev had found her, or rather, found the right person who knew her, which was how things worked in small coastal communities where everyone had overlapping connections and nobody wasted a phone call. Dr. Okwu spent 6 hours in the utility building, with the journals spread across every surface. Kodiak lay beside the stove and let her step over him twice without complaint. At the end of the 6 hours, she sat down on the workbench stool and said nothing for a while. Then, her name should have been in the record. "I know. She documented these patterns in 43 and 44. There are naval intelligence reports from the same period that describe some of the same anomalies. Different language, different conclusions. Credited to a lieutenant commander, whose subsequent record advanced considerably after the war." Calvin thought about the journals he'd read, the signal logs, the careful cross-references, the 3 letters to the naval intelligence contact in Seattle that had received no documented response. "She knew what she'd found," he said. Dr. Okwu nodded, and she knew what would happen to it. So she hid it in the only place she could be certain it wouldn't disappear, the place where she'd spent 19 years. Outside, the wind moved through the shore pines. The sound drifted up from the base of the bluff, steady and low. Inside the utility building, surrounded by the journals of a woman who had trusted that someone would eventually look for the truth. In a wall corner, Calvin Marsh sat, with his retired military dog, and understood something he hadn't quite put into words yet. Some things survive because someone refuses to let them disappear. He glanced at Kodiak. The Malinois had lifted his head and was looking at him. Not at Dr. Okwu, not at the journals, at Calvin, the way he always did. Thibault came back a month later. This time he didn't walk up the path. He came at 2 in the morning, and he didn't come alone. Kodiak woke Calvin with one low sound, then placed himself at the utility building door. Every muscle still. No bark, no movement, just positioned. Calvin heard the footsteps on the gravel outside. 2 sets. They stopped near the cottage door. He didn't have a weapon. He had a flashlight, a pry bar, and a dog that had been trained to respond to one specific command when there was no other option available. He gave the command. Kodiak went out the door and across the gravel in the dark, faster than most people expected a dog to move, and both men were still processing the sound when 102 pounds of Malinois arrived between them. One man ran immediately. The second tried to swing something and missed entirely, and Kodiak did not miss. And by the time Calvin came out the door with the flashlight, the second man was on the ground and wanting very much to be somewhere else. Kodiak had a cut along his front leg where the man's metal tool had caught him before he'd gotten clear. Not deep, but bleeding. Calvin pressed his jacket against it and held the light and looked at the man sitting in his gravel and felt nothing that resembled anger. Just a kind of tired clarity. The sheriff's deputy arrived in 22 minutes. Thibault was picked up at his vehicle 2 miles down the county road. Both men were processed and charged. That night, after the deputy left and the gravel was quiet again, Calvin sat on the floor of the utility building and cleaned Kodiak's leg with the medical kit he kept in his duffel. The dog allowed it without protest, but kept his eyes on the door. Still working, still guarding. You always were too stubborn to stand down, Calvin said. Kodiak's tail moved once. The wound healed over 6 weeks. The limp took a little longer. It remained slightly visible afterward. A small permanent lean to the right front leg that the veterinarian called insignificant, but that Calvin noticed every single morning. He always would. Spring arrived on the bluff the way it arrives on coastal Washington, tentatively, with long gray intervals between the clear days, but arriving nonetheless. The shore pines budded. Wildflowers came up along the south wall of the cottage, exactly where the photographs showed the garden had been in 1938. Something in the soil still remembered. Dr. Okwu's paper on Eleanor Reardon was published in a maritime history journal in March. The regional newspaper ran a feature in April. A Seattle television station sent a crew in May, and the segment ran on the evening news. And for 3 days Calvin's phone rang more than it had in the previous decade combined. None of that was what changed things. What changed things was a Tuesday morning in late April, when a silver Subaru pulled carefully into the gravel area at the top of the bluff path, and Calvin looked up from the porch framing he was replacing, and saw his daughter get out of the driver's side. She came alone, no Grant, no paperwork. Lydia walked down the path slowly, looking at the cottage, at the repaired chimney, at the new window frames, at the utility building where warm light still came from under the door on cold mornings. She looked at Kodiak, who stood beside Calvin with his slight rightward lean and his silver muzzle and his steady Malinois eyes. What happened to his leg? Calvin answered honestly. He protected the property. Lydia watched the dog for a moment. Then she looked at her father. She was older than he expected her to look. That was always the surprise with children you hadn't seen in months. Time moved the same direction on everyone. "We sold the house," she said. It was not a question. "I know. We thought we were doing the right thing." He didn't tell her she was wrong about that. He believed she'd thought so. He also believed that thinking something was right and it being right were not the same, and that his daughter was intelligent enough to have arrived at that conclusion on her own by now. "I should have called," she said. Yes, the wind came off the inlet and moved between them. Kodiak sat. A ferry appeared around the headland to the north, small and steady. Lydia wiped at her eyes once, quickly. She looked at the cottage. I didn't know you could do all this. Calvin considered that. Didn't know I needed to, he said. She asked to see inside. He took her through the cottage, the repaired floor, the cleared windows, the stove that now drew properly, the corner where the baseboard had concealed a sealed cedar panel, and behind it a box, and inside the box, 6 journals and a stack of letters, and the careful handwriting of a woman who had trusted that the truth was worth preserving. Lydia stood in that corner for a long moment. Then she asked if she could come back next weekend. Bring the kids. Calvin looked at Kodiak. The dog looked back at him, waiting, the way he always waited. He thought about what had stayed and what had left, about what cost loyalty and what cost nothing, and what that difference meant when you were standing in the middle of it. He thought about Eleanor Reardon, who had preserved her work without knowing who would find it or when, only that the truth was worth the trouble. He looked at his daughter. Sure, he said, bring them. The cottage was finished by the following autumn. Not restored exactly. Rebuilt, selectively. The parts worth keeping kept. The parts that had failed replaced with something that would last. A small interpretive display occupied the corner where Bev Alderton and Dr. Okwu had worked with the County Historical Society to mount photographs and reproductions of Eleanor Reardon's journals. A framed original letter hung beside it, the one Eleanor had written near the end of her time on the bluff. It ended with a sentence that Calvin had read perhaps 40 times by now, and still could not read without a long pause afterward. What I observed was real. What I recorded was true. I could not make anyone listen, but I could make sure the record survived. If you are reading this, then it did. The property was listed as a heritage site by December. A small parking area appeared at the top of the bluff. People came on weekends. Veterans came. Teachers brought students. A woman drove 4 hours from Spokane because her grandmother had served in a similar capacity during the war and had similarly left no trace in any official record. Calvin was there most mornings when the site opened. Not as a curator or a docent. As a caretaker. There was a difference, and the difference mattered to him. Kodiak came every day. His limp was part of him now. Children always asked about it, and Calvin always told the same truth. He earned it. That was always enough. On a clear evening in late October, Calvin carried a folding chair out to the edge of the bluff and sat in the last of the afternoon light. The Sound stretched out below him, silver and gray, the far shore dark with trees. A container ship moved slowly north, lights beginning to show in the early dark. Kodiak lay in the grass beside him. His nose moved with the wind, still working. He would never entirely stop. Calvin closed his eyes, not because he was tired, because the quiet was the kind he hadn't known in years, the kind that didn't have anything hidden inside it. No waiting sound, no old alarm, no shape of a place that wasn't this one rising up behind his eyelids. Just the wind off the water and the grass and the distant sound of the ferry. He thought about $23. About a collapsed porch and a sealed corner and a box that no one had opened in 60 years. About a woman who had stood in this same wind and decided that the truth was worth more than recognition, and who had trusted that eventually someone would understand that. He looked at Kodiak. The dog opened one eye. You found her first, Calvin said. The Malinois closed his eye again. The last light moved off the water. Stars came up over the eastern hills, one at a time. Then all at once, the ferry horn sounded once across the inlet, low and long. Calvin let it pass. For the first time in a very long while, it was only a sound.